Fast forward to the bustling streets of Paris in the year 1200, when the city was becoming the intellectual capital of Europe. You would hear Latin conversations echoing from newly built stone buildings, where young men from across the continent gathered to debate the most profound questions of human existence. These were not the dark ages that many people imagine when they think of medieval times, but rather a period of extraordinary intellectual excitement when some of the most brilliant minds in human history were attempting something that had never been tried before on such a grand scale. They were trying to create a complete and unified understanding of reality that would harmonize the wisdom of ancient Greek philosophers with the revealed truths of religious faith, using the most rigorous methods of logical reasoning that human beings had yet developed. The intellectual revolution that transformed European thought between the years 1000 and 1400 did not happen in isolation, but was part of a broader cultural awakening that touched every aspect of medieval life. The economic prosperity that came from improved agricultural techniques and expanded trade created surplus wealth that could support educational institutions and scholarly activity. The political stability that emerged from the feudal system provided the security necessary for long-term intellectual projects. The spiritual enthusiasm generated by religious reform movements created a hunger for deeper understanding of divine truth. Most importantly, the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, particularly the complete works of Aristotle, provided medieval thinkers with sophisticated philosophical tools that had been largely unknown in Western Europe for centuries. The scholastic method that became the hallmark of medieval intellectual life was not simply a way of organizing debates, but a comprehensive approach to discovering truth that reflected deep assumptions about the nature of reality and knowledge. Scholastic thinkers believed that truth was one and unified, so that properly conducted rational inquiry could never genuinely contradict revealed religious truth, even though apparent contradictions might arise from incomplete understanding or faulty reasoning. They also believed that human reason, despite being limited and fallible, was capable of discovering genuine truths about the most fundamental questions of existence when it was properly trained and carefully applied. The scholastic technique of posing a question, presenting arguments on multiple sides, and then resolving the apparent contradictions was designed to ensure that no relevant considerations would be overlooked and that conclusions would be reached through careful weighing of evidence rather than through prejudice or hasty judgment. A typical scholastic discussion would begin with a precise formulation of the question to be investigated, such as whether the world is eternal or created in time, or whether human beings have free will or are determined by divine providence. The next step would involve presenting the strongest possible arguments for each major position on the question, drawing on authoritative sources from both philosophical and religious traditions. The most challenging and creative part of the scholastic method came in the resolution, where the thinker had to find a way to preserve what was true in each of the conflicting arguments while explaining why the arguments seemed to contradict each other. This often required making subtle distinctions that had not been recognized before, or developing new concepts that could bridge apparent gaps between different approaches to the same question. The goal was not to win a debate by defeating opponents, but to achieve a deeper understanding that could incorporate insights from multiple perspectives into a more complete and unified vision of truth. The institutional setting that made this intellectual revolution possible was the emergence of universities as permanent centres of higher learning that could preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. The University of Bologna, founded around 1070, began as a centre for legal studies where students from across Europe came to learn Roman law and canon law from masters who had devoted their lives to understanding these complex legal systems. The University of Paris, which emerged around 1150, grew out of the cathedral schools that had been training clergy and developed into a comprehensive centre for studying theology, philosophy and the liberal arts. The University of Oxford, established around 1167, was founded by English scholars who had studied in Paris and wanted to create a similar institution in their homeland. These universities were not just schools in the modern sense, but were corporations or guilds of masters and students who governed themselves according to their own statutes and elected their own officials. They had the legal right to award degrees that were recognized throughout Europe, and they provided a kind of intellectual citizenship that transcended the political boundaries between kingdoms and city-states. A master who earned his degree at Paris could teach at Oxford or Bologna, and students could travel from one university to another to study with particular teachers or to pursue specialized courses of study. The curriculum at medieval universities was based on the 7 liberal arts that had been inherited from ancient Roman education. Grammar, rhetoric and logic formed the elementary trivium, while arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy constituted the more advanced quadrivium. Students typically spent several years mastering these foundational subjects before proceeding to advanced study in theology, law or medicine. The emphasis on logic was particularly important because it provided the analytical tools necessary for the sophisticated arguments that characterized scholastic thought. The intellectual ferment in Christian Europe during this period was deeply influenced by developments in Islamic philosophy that had been taking place for several centuries in the Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Islamic philosophers had preserved and translated the complete corpus of Aristotelian texts during the early centuries of Islamic expansion, and they had developed sophisticated interpretations of Aristotelian philosophy that addressed the relationship between philosophical reasoning and Islamic religious doctrine. When these Arabic translations and commentaries began to be translated into Latin during the 12th century, they provided Christian thinkers with access to philosophical resources that transformed European intellectual life. The most influential Islamic philosopher for later medieval thought was Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes, who lived in Islamic Spain from 1126 to 1198. Averroes was not just a philosopher but also a physician, mathematician and Islamic judge who embodied the ideal of the universal scholar that characterized Islamic intellectual culture at its height. His commentaries on Aristotle were so comprehensive and penetrating that he became known simply as the commentator in medieval Christian universities, where his interpretations of Aristotelian texts were studied alongside the original works. Averroes argued that properly conducted philosophical reasoning could achieve genuine knowledge about the fundamental structure of reality, including truths about the nature of God, the eternity of the world, and the immortality of the human soul. He maintained that these philosophical conclusions were not only compatible with Islamic religious doctrine, but actually provided deeper insight into the meaning of religious revelation than was available through purely literal interpretation of religious texts. Religious language, according to Averroes, was designed to communicate truth to ordinary believers who lacked the training necessary for philosophical reasoning, while philosophical demonstration revealed the same truths in a more precise and complete form. This position led to what became known as the double-truth controversy, though Averroes himself never advocated the view that philosophical and religious truths could genuinely contradict each other. The controversy arose from the question of what philosophers should do when their rational conclusions seemed to conflict with accepted religious teachings. Some interpreters of Averroes suggested that he believed philosophers could hold one set of beliefs as philosophically true while publicly affirming contradictory beliefs as religiously required. However, Averroes actually argued that apparent contradictions between philosophy and religion always resulted from either faulty philosophical reasoning or inadequate understanding of religious texts. The most sophisticated Islamic critic of philosophy was Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111, and whose influence on Islamic intellectual culture was enormous and long-lasting. Al-Ghazali had been trained in philosophy and was deeply familiar with the works of earlier Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, but he came to believe that philosophical reasoning was inherently limited and could not provide reliable knowledge about the most important religious truths. His work, titled The Incoherence of the Philosophers, presented detailed criticisms of philosophical arguments on 20 key issues, including the eternity of the world, the nature of divine knowledge, and the possibility of bodily resurrection. Al-Ghazali's critique was not a rejection of rational thinking in general, but rather an argument that human reason had definite limits beyond which it could not go without falling into error and contradiction. He argued that philosophers had overestimated the power of rational demonstration and had failed to recognize that the most important truths about God and human destiny were accessible only through mystical experience and divine revelation. His alternative approach emphasized spiritual purification and direct religious experience as more reliable paths to ultimate truth than philosophical speculation. The debate between Al-Ghazali and the philosophical tradition represented by Averroes centered on fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and revelation that would also become central to medieval Christian and Jewish thought. One of the most important specific issues in this debate was the question of whether the world is eternal or created in time. Aristotelian philosophy seemed to require that the world is eternal because motion and change require the existence of moving things, and there could not have been a first moment of motion without some prior motion to cause it. However, Islamic, Christian, and Jewish religious traditions all taught that God created the world at a particular moment in time, and that the world would not exist without God's creative activity. Al-Ghazali argued that the philosophical arguments for the eternity of the world were inconclusive because they were based on assumptions about causation and time that could not be demonstrated with certainty. He contended that God's creative power was not limited by the natural patterns that philosophers observed in their study of physical processes, and that divine creation involved a kind of causation that was fundamentally different from natural causation. Averroes responded that properly understood philosophical arguments did not conflict with religious teachings about creation because they were addressing different aspects of the relationship between God and the world. Jewish medieval philosophy developed in constant dialogue with both Islamic philosophical traditions and Christian scholastic thought, as Jewish communities throughout Europe and the Islamic world struggled to maintain their religious identity while participating in the broader intellectual culture of their time. The most towering figure in medieval Jewish philosophy was Moses ben Maimon, known as Maimonides, or by the Hebrew acronym Rambam, who lived from 1135 to 1204 and spent most of his career in Egypt serving as both a rabbi and a physician. Maimonides wrote his masterwork, The Guide for the Perplexed, for educated Jews who had studied philosophy and found themselves confused about how to reconcile Aristotelian ideas with traditional Jewish beliefs. He argued that properly understood Jewish teachings were not only compatible with philosophical reasoning, but actually required philosophical interpretation to be correctly understood. The anthropomorphic language used in biblical texts to describe God was necessary for communicating with ordinary believers, but sophisticated readers needed to understand that this language was metaphorical rather than literal. According to Maimonides, human reason could demonstrate that God exists, that God is one and incorporeal, and that God is the ultimate source of all existence and value. However, reason could not provide positive knowledge about God's essential nature, which remained fundamentally mysterious and beyond human comprehension. This position, known as negative theology, maintained that the most accurate way to speak about God was to say what God is not rather than what God is, because any positive description would inevitably be inadequate and potentially misleading. Maimonides' influence extended far beyond Jewish communities and significantly shaped both Islamic and Christian thought. His philosophical arguments were studied and debated by Islamic philosophers like Averroes, and his theological positions were incorporated into Christian scholastic discussions by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. His medical writings were translated into Latin and used in European universities for centuries. His legal scholarship established him as one of the most authoritative interpreters of Jewish law in the entire tradition of rabbinic literature. The synthesis between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology reached its highest development in the work of Thomas Aquinas, who was born around 1225 into a noble Italian family and died in 1274 while travelling to participate in a church council. Aquinas studied at the University of Paris under Albert the Great, who was himself one of the leading Aristotelian scholars of his generation, and he spent most of his career teaching at Paris and other universities, while also serving as an advisor to popes and church councils on theological and political questions. Aquinas approached the relationship between faith and reason with a systematic precision that had not been achieved by any previous thinker. He argued that human reason and divine revelation were both authentic sources of truth that could never genuinely contradict each other because they both originated from God. However, he also maintained that reason and revelation operated in different domains and used different methods to arrive at their conclusions. Natural reason, working from empirical observation and logical analysis, could demonstrate certain truths about God and morality that were accessible to all human beings regardless of their religious beliefs. Revealed theology, based on divine revelation as transmitted through scripture and church tradition, provided access to truths about God's inner nature and God's plan for human salvation that were beyond the reach of natural reason. The 5 ways that Aquinas developed to demonstrate God's existence using reason alone represented one of the most sophisticated attempts in the history of philosophy to bridge the gap between philosophical argument and religious belief. The first way argued that because we observe motion and change in the world, there must be a first mover that causes motion without itself being moved. The second way argued that because we observe efficient causation in the world, there must be a first cause that causes other things without itself being caused. The third way argued that because we observe contingent beings that might or might not exist, There must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent on anything else. The fourth way argued that because we observe degrees of perfection in different beings, there must be a most perfect being that serves as the standard for all other perfections. The fifth way argued that because we observe purposeful organization in natural processes, there must be an intelligent designer that directs natural things toward their appropriate ends. Each of these arguments was designed to be a strict logical demonstration that moved from premises that any rational person would accept to a conclusion that established at least some of the characteristics traditionally attributed to God. Aquinas' natural law theory provided a framework for understanding moral principles as discoverable by reason rather than dependent solely on divine commands or cultural conventions. He argued that human beings, like all natural things, have a specific nature that determines what kinds of activities and relationships are appropriate for their flourishing. Moral principles are not arbitrary rules imposed by external authority, but rather rational insights into the requirements of human nature properly understood. Because human beings are rational animals who naturally live in political communities, moral principles will emphasize the development of rational capacities and the maintenance of social relationships that allow all members of the community to flourish. The most comprehensive expression of Aquinas' systematic approach to theology was his Summa Theologica, an enormous work that he intended as a complete introduction to Christian theology for beginning students. The Summa was organized according to the scholastic method, with each major topic divided into questions, each question divided into articles, and each article structured according to the pattern of presenting objections, citing contrary authorities, providing a systematic response, and then answering the objections in light of the systematic response. The work covered virtually every aspect of Christian doctrine, from the nature of God and the structure of creation to the details of moral theology and the sacramental life of the Church. What made the Summa revolutionary was not just its comprehensiveness, but its method of integrating philosophical reasoning with theological reflection in a way that respected the integrity of both approaches, while showing how they could work together to produce deeper understanding. Aquinas demonstrated that sophisticated philosophical analysis could illuminate the meaning of religious doctrines without undermining their supernatural character, and that revealed truths could provide a broader context for philosophical insights without contradicting the findings of natural reason. The relationship between faith and reason in Aquinas was not a simple harmony, but a complex interaction in which each approach contributed something essential to complete understanding. Reason provided the conceptual tools and logical methods necessary for precise theological thinking, while faith provided access to truths about God's nature and purposes that could not be discovered through natural reason alone. Reason could show that it was rational to believe in God's existence and to accept the possibility of divine revelation, while faith provided the specific content of what God had chosen to reveal about the divine nature and the path to human salvation. However, the Thomistic synthesis that seemed so complete and authoritative in the 13th century began to face serious challenges in the 14th century from thinkers who questioned some of its fundamental assumptions. John Duns Scotus, who lived from approximately 1266 to 1308 and was known as the Subtle Doctor because of his extraordinarily precise logical analyses, argued that Aquinas had overemphasized the role of divine reason at the expense of divine will in understanding God's relationship to creation. According to Scotus, God's freedom was more fundamental than God's rationality, which meant that God could have created a different kind of world with different natural laws and different moral principles if God had chosen to do so. The moral principles that we discover through natural reason are binding on us because God has willed that they should be binding, not because they flow necessarily from God's rational nature or from the essential structure of reality. This position, known as voluntarism, emphasized the contingency and dependence of all created reality on God's free choice in a way that made the relationship between philosophy and theology more problematic. William of Ockham, who lived from approximately 1287 to 1347, and studied at Oxford before becoming involved in political controversies that led to his excommunication, pushed the critique of the Thomistic synthesis even further by questioning whether human reason could achieve reliable knowledge about God and spiritual realities. Ockham is best known for the methodological principle called Ockham's razor, which states that explanation should not multiply entities beyond necessity, meaning that simpler explanations are preferable to more complex ones when both can account for the same phenomena. Ockham applied this principle to argue against the existence of universal natures or essences that medieval philosophers had generally accepted as real features of the world. According to Ockham's nominalism, universal concepts like humanity, justice or redness do not correspond to real universal entities, but are simply names that we use to group together individual things that resemble each other in certain respects. This position had significant implications for natural theology because many traditional arguments for God's existence depended on the assumption that universal concepts corresponded to real universal features of reality. Ockham also argued that the relationship between natural reason and revealed theology was much more tenuous than Aquinas had suggested. While reason might be able to show that belief in God was not irrational, it could not provide strict demonstrations of God's existence or nature that would be convincing to someone who did not already accept religious premises. This meant that theology was much more dependent on faith and much less supported by philosophical reasoning than the great scholastic synthesizers had claimed. The political dimensions of Ockham's thought were as radical as his philosophical and theological positions. He became involved in a dispute between Pope John XXII and the Franciscan order over the question of apostolic poverty, arguing that the Pope did not have unlimited authority over temporal matters and that secular rulers derived their authority directly from God rather than through papal mediation. These arguments contributed to the development of conciliar theory, which maintained that church councils had authority superior to that of individual popes and to early versions of social contract theory, which would later influence modern democratic thought. The breakdown of the medieval synthesis that had been achieved by thinkers like Aquinas was not simply the result of intellectual disagreements, but reflected broader cultural and social changes that were transforming European civilization in the 14th century. The Black Death that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351 killed approximately one-third of the population and created social and economic disruption that challenged traditional authority structures. The Great Schism that divided the Catholic Church between rival popes from 1378 to 1417 undermined confidence in ecclesiastical institutions and encouraged new forms of religious expression. The rise of vernacular literature and the gradual decline of Latin as the universal language of educated discourse reflected the emergence of national cultures that were less unified around common intellectual traditions. The growth of urban commercial culture created new social classes whose interests and perspectives were not adequately represented by the feudal and ecclesiastical institutions that had supported medieval intellectual life. The rediscovery of additional ancient texts, particularly Platonic and Neoplatonic works that had been unavailable to earlier medieval thinkers, provided alternative philosophical resources that challenged Aristotelian assumptions about the nature of reality and knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, the success of medieval philosophy in developing sophisticated methods of logical analysis and systematic argumentation created tools that could be used to criticize the very intellectual edifice that medieval thinkers had constructed. The scholastic method that had been designed to harmonize different sources of truth became a means for exposing contradictions and inconsistencies that previous generations had not recognized. The emphasis on precise conceptual analysis that had been developed to clarify theological doctrines became a way of questioning whether those doctrines could be adequately supported by rational argument. The medieval synthesis had been based on the assumption that reality was fundamentally rational and that human reason, despite its limitations, was capable of discovering genuine truths about the most important questions of existence. This assumption made it possible to believe that properly conducted philosophical inquiry would ultimately support rather than undermine religious faith, and that the various sources of human knowledge would eventually be shown to be compatible with each other. However, the intellectual developments of the late medieval period suggested that these assumptions might be too optimistic, and that the relationship between reason and faith might be more complex and problematic than earlier thinkers had realized. The legacy of medieval philosophy extends far beyond its historical significance as a bridge between ancient and modern thought. Medieval thinkers developed many of the conceptual distinctions and analytical methods that continue to be used in contemporary philosophy, theology, and other academic disciplines. They pioneered the institutional forms of higher education that became the foundation for modern universities. They created the first systematic attempts to integrate scientific and religious worldviews in ways that respected the integrity of both approaches to understanding reality. Most importantly, medieval philosophy demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of human reason when applied to the most fundamental questions of existence. Medieval thinkers showed that rational inquiry could achieve remarkable sophistication and could illuminate aspects of reality that had not been clearly understood before. They also showed that reason operates within definite limits and that some of the most important truths about human existence might not be accessible through rational demonstration alone. This tension between confidence in reason and recognition of its limitations would continue to characterize philosophical inquiry in subsequent periods and remains relevant to contemporary debates about the relationship between science, philosophy, and religion. The medieval period was not a dark age of ignorance and superstition, but rather a time of extraordinary intellectual creativity when some of the most brilliant minds in human history grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and value. The fact that their specific answers to these questions may seem inadequate or outdated from our contemporary perspective should not blind us to the sophistication of their methods or the enduring importance of the questions they were addressing. Medieval philosophy represents one of the great achievements of human intellectual culture and continues to provide valuable insights for anyone who is seriously interested in understanding the relationship between rational inquiry and other sources of human knowledge and wisdom. Chapter 6. Renaissance, Humanism and Scientific Revolution, 1400 to 1600. The great medieval synthesis that Thomas Aquinas and his fellow scholastics had built was beginning to crack by the early 15th century. The Black Death had swept through Europe, killing 1/3 of the population and shaking people's faith in the old certainties. The papal court had been split between Rome and Avignon, undermining the authority of the Church. Meanwhile, Byzantine scholars, fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453, brought with them precious Greek manuscripts that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. These texts would spark a revolution in how people thought about themselves, their place in the universe, and the very nature of knowledge itself. In the bustling city-states of Italy, where merchants grew wealthy from trade, and banking families like the Medici became patrons of learning, a new movement was taking shape. The humanists, as they came to be called, were not necessarily opposed to Christianity, but they were fascinated by the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. They believed that by studying the original sources, rather than the medieval commentaries that had accumulated over the centuries, they could rediscover truths that had been obscured or forgotten. This was not just an academic exercise, but a deeply personal quest to understand what it meant to be human. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant young nobleman born in 1463, embodied this new spirit of inquiry. At the remarkable age of 23, he composed what would become one of the most influential philosophical texts of the Renaissance, the Oration on the Dignity of Man. This work was originally intended as an introduction to a public debate he planned to hold in Rome, where he would defend 900 theses on everything from philosophy to theology to magic. The debate never took place because the Pope condemned some of his theses as heretical, but the oration survived to inspire generations of thinkers. Pico's central insight was revolutionary for its time. Medieval thinkers had generally seen humans as occupying a fixed place in the great chain of being, somewhere between the angels and the animals. But Pico argued that humans were unique among all creatures because God had given them no fixed nature. Instead, humans possessed the extraordinary ability to shape themselves into whatever they chose to become. In his oration, Pico imagined God speaking to Adam at the moment of creation, saying that while all other creatures had been given specific natures and roles, humans alone were given the freedom to determine their own destiny. They could sink to the level of beasts through vice and ignorance, or rise to the level of angels through virtue and wisdom. This idea of humans as self-creating beings struck at the heart of medieval assumptions about the fixed order of society and the predetermined nature of human life. It suggested that individuals had far more power and responsibility than previously imagined. Birth, social class, and traditional roles need not determine a person's ultimate worth or achievement. Through education, virtue, and the cultivation of their rational and spiritual capacities, humans could transcend the circumstances of their birth and achieve genuine dignity. The humanist movement spread throughout Europe, transforming education and scholarship. Instead of spending all their time on theological disputes and Aristotelian logic, scholars began to study rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. They learned Greek as well as Latin, enabling them to read Homer, Plato, and the Greek tragedians in their original language. This return to original sources had profound implications, as scholars discovered that many medieval interpretations of ancient texts had been based on imperfect translations or limited selections of works. The political world of Renaissance Italy provided a perfect laboratory for testing new ideas about human nature and society. The Italian city-states were constantly at war with each other, forming and breaking alliances, experiencing sudden reversals of fortune that could elevate a merchant to princely status or destroy an ancient noble family overnight. Traditional medieval theories about legitimate authority and Christian kingship seemed inadequate to explain or guide behavior in this chaotic but dynamic environment. Into this world stepped Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and political theorist whose name would become synonymous with cunning and ruthless pragmatism. Born in 1469, Machiavelli served the Florentine Republic for 14 years as a diplomat and administrator, travelling throughout Europe and observing firsthand how power really operated. When the Medici family returned to power in Florence in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed from office and briefly imprisoned on suspicion of conspiracy. It was during his enforced retirement that he wrote his most famous work, The Prince, completed around 1513, though not published until after his death. The Prince was shocking because it openly acknowledged the gap between how rulers were supposed to behave according to Christian morality and how they actually had to behave to survive and prosper. Medieval political theory had always insisted that good rulers should be virtuous, just, merciful and truthful. Machiavelli did not necessarily disagree with these ideals, but he pointed out that a ruler who always acted virtuously in a world where others did not would quickly find himself destroyed. The key insight was his recognition that politics operated according to its own logic, which was often at odds with conventional morality. This led to Machiavelli's famous question about whether it was better for a ruler to be feared or loved. His answer was characteristically complex and practical. Ideally, a ruler would be both feared and loved, but since this was difficult to achieve, fear was more reliable than love. Love depends on the goodwill of others and can disappear quickly when circumstances change, but fear, when properly managed, creates a more stable foundation for power. However, Machiavelli was careful to distinguish between being feared and being hated. A ruler should inspire fear through strength and decisiveness, not through cruelty and injustice, which would eventually provoke rebellion. Machiavelli's approach represented a fundamental shift in political thinking. Instead of starting with abstract principles about how society ought to be organized, he began with careful observation of how political power actually worked in practice. He studied successful rulers like Cesare Borgia, analyzing their methods without moral judgment. This empirical approach to politics was revolutionary because it suggested that effective governance required understanding the world as it was, not as it ought to be. The implications of Machiavellian thinking extended far beyond politics. By suggesting that different spheres of human activity might operate according to different moral standards, Machiavelli opened the door to a more complex understanding of human nature and social organization. The unity of medieval Christendom, where religious and secular authority were supposed to work together toward the same spiritual goals, was giving way to a world where different institutions and professions might legitimately pursue different ends. While humanists were revolutionizing political and moral philosophy, an equally dramatic transformation was occurring in natural philosophy, what we now call science. For over 1,000 years, educated Europeans had accepted the cosmological system developed by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy and refined by medieval Islamic and Christian scholars. According to this system, the Earth stood motionless at the centre of the universe, surrounded by crystalline spheres that carried the sun, moon, planets and stars in perfect circular orbits. This geocentric worldview fit perfectly with Christian theology, which taught that humans were the special focus of God's creation and redemptive plan. The first serious challenge to this system came from an unlikely source, a Polish church administrator named Nicolaus Copernicus. Born in 1473, Copernicus studied mathematics and astronomy at the universities of Krakow and Bologna before returning to Poland to serve as a canon in the Cathedral of Frombork. Like many intellectuals of his time, he was troubled by the growing complexity of astronomical calculations needed to predict planetary positions using the Ptolemaic system. Over centuries, astronomers had added more and more epicycles, small circular orbits superimposed on the main planetary orbits to account for observed discrepancies. The system worked, but it had become extremely cumbersome. Copernicus proposed a radical simplification. What if the Sun, not the Earth, stood at the centre of the planetary system? This heliocentric model, he argued, could explain the observed motions of the planets more elegantly and with fewer assumptions. He worked on this theory for decades, refining his calculations and considering the implications. The mathematical advantages were clear, but Copernicus understood that his theory would be controversial because it challenged both scientific orthodoxy and religious belief. The publication of Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres in 1543 marked the beginning of what historians call the scientific revolution. The book's impact was not immediate, partly because Copernicus had died just as it was published and partly because the theory was presented in highly technical mathematical language that few could understand. But gradually astronomers and mathematicians began to recognize the power of the heliocentric model. The philosophical implications of Copernican astronomy were profound. If the Earth was just another planet orbiting the Sun, then humans could no longer claim to occupy the physical center of creation. This cosmological displacement challenged the anthropocentric worldview that had dominated medieval thought. Humans were still special in having rational souls and moral responsibility, but their cosmic significance was called into question. The tension between the new astronomy and traditional beliefs came to a head in the career of Galileo Galilei, born in Pisa in 1564. Galileo was a professor of mathematics who became fascinated by the possibilities of a new invention, the telescope, for astronomical observation. Beginning in 1609, he turned his improved telescopes toward the heavens and made a series of discoveries that shook the foundations of traditional cosmology. Through his telescope, Galileo observed that the moon's surface was rough and mountainous, not the perfect sphere that Aristotelian physics required. He discovered 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not all celestial bodies circled the Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun. He saw that the Milky Way was composed of countless individual stars, suggesting that the universe was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. But Galileo's most revolutionary contribution was not any single discovery, but his insistence that mathematics was the proper language for understanding nature. Medieval natural philosophers had relied primarily on qualitative descriptions and explanations based on purposes and final causes. Galileo argued that the book of nature was written in mathematical characters, and that only by measuring, quantifying and expressing natural phenomena in mathematical relationships, could humans achieve true knowledge of the physical world. This mathematical approach led to what historians call the mechanical worldview, a way of understanding nature that would dominate scientific thinking for centuries. According to this view, the natural world operated like a vast machine, with all phenomena ultimately reducible to the motions of particles governed by mathematical laws. This was a dramatic departure from the Aristotelian physics that had dominated medieval thought, which explained natural phenomena in terms of inherent purposes and qualities. The mechanical worldview had profound philosophical implications. It suggested that the same mathematical laws that govern the motions of the planets might also explain terrestrial phenomena, like falling objects and projectile motion. This implied a fundamental unity in nature that contradicted the medieval distinction between the perfect, unchanging celestial realm and the imperfect, changing terrestrial world. If nature was truly uniform and law-governed, then human reason, through mathematics and careful observation, might eventually understand all natural phenomena. Francis Bacon, an English lawyer and philosopher born in 1561, provided the methodological foundation for this new approach to understanding nature. Bacon was not primarily a scientist himself, but rather a philosopher who thought deeply about how knowledge could be advanced more effectively. He was deeply critical of the medieval scholastic method, which he saw as producing endless debates about abstract questions while failing to increase practical knowledge about the natural world. Bacon proposed what he called the new method, or new organon, referring to Aristotle's logical works known as the Organon. Instead of beginning with general principles and deducing particular conclusions, as the scholastics had done, Bacon argued that natural philosophers should begin with careful observation of particular phenomena and gradually build up to general laws through inductive reasoning. This empirical method would be slow and painstaking, but it would produce reliable knowledge that could be used to improve human life. Central to Bacon's vision was his famous declaration that knowledge is power. This was not merely an abstract philosophical claim, but a practical program for human advancement. By understanding the laws that govern natural phenomena, humans could learn to control and manipulate nature for their benefit. This represented a fundamental shift from the medieval view that the highest form of knowledge was contemplative understanding of eternal truths. Bacon envisioned knowledge as an active force for transforming the material conditions of human existence. Bacon's emphasis on the practical benefits of natural knowledge reflected the changing economic and social conditions of his time. The Renaissance had seen the rise of new technologies, from improved navigation instruments to more efficient printing presses that were transforming commerce and communication. The discovery of the Americas had opened new possibilities for trade and colonization. In this dynamic environment, knowledge that could be applied to solve practical problems was increasingly valued alongside traditional learning. The scientific revolution was occurring simultaneously with another great upheaval in European thought, the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, challenging the Catholic Church's practices regarding indulgences, he set in motion a religious revolution that would permanently fracture the unity of Western Christianity. The philosophical implications of this religious revolution were as significant as those of the scientific revolution. The Protestant reformers insisted on the principle of sola scriptura, meaning that Scripture alone, not church tradition or papal authority, should be the ultimate source of religious truth. This required individual believers to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, rather than simply accepting the interpretations provided by church authorities. This emphasis on individual interpretation represented a dramatic shift from the medieval assumption that religious truth was mediated through institutional authority. The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God resonated with the humanist celebration of human dignity and capacity for self-determination. Both movements, in different ways, challenged the medieval assumption that individuals should accept their place in established hierarchies without question. The Protestant believer, like the humanist scholar, was called to think for himself and take personal responsibility for fundamental questions about truth and meaning. However, the proliferation of competing religious interpretations created new philosophical problems. If individuals were free to interpret Scripture for themselves, what would prevent the emergence of contradictory and incompatible beliefs? The Catholic Church had provided a mechanism for resolving religious disputes through appeals to papal authority and church tradition. Protestant churches struggled to develop alternative mechanisms for maintaining doctrinal unity while preserving the principle of individual interpretation. The problem became acute during the religious wars that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Catholics and Protestants, each convinced that they possessed the true interpretation of Christian doctrine, engaged in brutal conflicts that seemed to demonstrate the destructive potential of religious disagreement. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established the principle that each ruler could determine the religion of his territory. But this political solution did not resolve the underlying philosophical problem of how to determine religious truth when authorities disagreed. These religious conflicts created a pressing need for new approaches to truth and knowledge that could transcend sectarian divisions. Some thinkers began to explore whether reason, independent of religious revelation, might provide a more reliable foundation for knowledge. Others investigated whether there might be common moral principles that all reasonable people could accept regardless of their particular religious beliefs. These investigations would lay the groundwork for the philosophical developments of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Renaissance period also witnessed significant developments in political philosophy beyond Machiavelli's innovations. The emergence of centralized monarchies in countries like France and Spain challenged traditional medieval ideas about the relationship between ruler and ruled. The discovery of previously unknown peoples in the Americas raised new questions about the universality of European political and moral concepts. Were the political arrangements that Europeans took for granted natural and universal, or were they merely local customs that had developed in particular historical circumstances? These questions became more pressing as European powers established colonies and trading posts around the world. The encounter with different cultures forced Europeans to confront the possibility that their own ways of organizing society were not the only possible or legitimate arrangements. Some thinkers, like the Spanish Dominican Francisco de Vitoria, developed sophisticated theories of international law that attempted to establish universal principles governing relations between different peoples and cultures. The technological innovations of the Renaissance period also had philosophical implications. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge by making books much cheaper and more widely available. This technological change undermined the traditional monopoly of universities and monasteries over learning, making it possible for ideas to spread more rapidly and widely than ever before. The availability of printed books also changed the nature of scholarship itself. Scholars could now compare different versions of ancient texts more easily, leading to more accurate editions and better understanding of classical authors. The ability to produce identical copies of texts meant that scholars in different locations could refer to exactly the same passages when discussing philosophical questions, improving the precision and reliability of scholarly communication. Navigation instruments like the compass and astrolabe enabled European explorers to venture into previously unknown waters with greater confidence. These technological achievements demonstrated the practical value of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, reinforcing the arguments of thinkers like Bacon, who insisted that natural philosophy should aim at useful results rather than merely theoretical understanding. The Renaissance period was thus characterized by multiple, interconnected revolutions in human thought and practice. The humanist rediscovery of classical learning challenged medieval assumptions about human nature and potential. The scientific revolution introduced new methods for understanding the natural world and humanity's place within it. The Protestant Reformation undermined traditional religious authority and emphasized individual responsibility for determining truth. Political theorists like Machiavelli developed more realistic and empirical approaches to understanding power and governance. These various developments did not always support each other and sometimes created new tensions and contradictions. The humanist celebration of human dignity and capacity for self-determination could conflict with the Protestant emphasis on human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace. The mathematical approach to nature championed by Galileo and others seemed to reduce the natural world to quantifiable properties, potentially eliminating the qualitative richness that had characterized medieval natural philosophy. The Machiavellian separation of politics from conventional morality raised questions about whether effective action in the world required abandoning traditional ethical principles. By 1600, European intellectual life had been transformed almost beyond recognition from what it had been in 1400. The unified worldview of medieval Christendom had given way to a more complex and often contradictory set of approaches to fundamental questions about knowledge, human nature, political organization, and the structure of reality itself. The stage was set for the further developments of the 17th century, when philosophers like René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke would attempt to construct new systematic approaches to these questions that could address the challenges and opportunities created by Renaissance innovations. The legacy of Renaissance humanism and the scientific revolution would continue to shape Western thought for centuries to come. The humanist emphasis on individual dignity and potential would influence democratic political theory and human rights concepts. The scientific method developed during this period would become the foundation for modern empirical investigation. The Machiavellian approach to political analysis would evolve into modern political science. The Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation would contribute to later ideas about religious freedom and the rights of conscience. Perhaps most importantly, the Renaissance period established the principle that traditional authorities and received wisdom should be subject to critical examination. Whether in science, politics, religion, or philosophy, thinkers of this period demonstrated that inherited ideas should be tested against experience, reason, and evidence rather than simply accepted because they were old or because they came from respected sources. This critical spirit would become one of the defining characteristics of modern Western thought, creating both the opportunities and the challenges that continue to shape intellectual life today. Chapter 7. The Birth of Modern Philosophy. The year was 1637, when a French gentleman named René Descartes published a small book that would shake the foundations of human knowledge forever. Unlike the grand philosophical treatises of medieval times, this work was written in everyday French rather than scholarly Latin, signalling that something revolutionary was about to unfold. Descartes had spent years travelling across Europe, observing different cultures and their conflicting beliefs, and had become deeply troubled by a fundamental question. In a world where people disagreed about almost everything, how could anyone know what was truly real? This question launched what we now call the modern period of philosophy, stretching from 1600 to 1700, a century that would witness some of the most brilliant minds in human history grappling with the deepest questions about knowledge, reality, and human nature. The medieval world had crumbled, with its unified Christian worldview giving way to religious wars, scientific discoveries, and competing authorities. Philosophers found themselves in desperate need of new foundations for knowledge, and their search would create two great rival traditions that continue to shape our thinking today. René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. René Descartes was born in 1596 in a small French town, the son of a lawyer who expected his boy to follow a conventional path. But young René had other plans. After receiving an excellent education from the Jesuits, where he learned mathematics, physics, and philosophy, Descartes found himself deeply dissatisfied with the uncertain state of human knowledge. He had noticed that mathematics provided clear, certain knowledge that everyone could agree upon, while philosophy and other subjects seemed filled with endless debates and contradictions. The turning point came during a famous night in November 1619, when Descartes was serving as a soldier in Germany. Trapped in a heated room during a blizzard, he experienced what he called 3 dreams that revealed to him his life's mission: to create a universal method that would bring the same certainty to all human knowledge that mathematics enjoyed. This was an audacious goal, nothing less than rebuilding human knowledge from the ground up. Descartes began his revolutionary project by asking a simple but profound question: what can I know with absolute certainty? To answer this, he developed what became known as the method of systematic doubt. This method involved doubting everything that could possibly be false, no matter how unlikely the doubt might seem. He began by noting that our senses sometimes deceive us. We might think we see water on a hot road, only to discover it was a mirage. If our senses can trick us even once, how can we trust them completely? But Descartes pushed his doubt even further. Perhaps everything we think we know about the external world is false. Maybe there is no physical world at all, and everything we experience is just a dream. He even considered the possibility that an evil demon might be deceiving him about everything, making him believe in a world that does not exist and feeding him false mathematical truths. Yet, even as Descartes doubted everything around him, he realized there was one thing he could not doubt: the fact that he was doubting. And if he was doubting, then he must be thinking. And if he was thinking, then he must exist. This led him to his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. This single certainty became the bedrock upon which Descartes would rebuild all human knowledge. From this foundation, Descartes argued that he could prove the existence of God and the external world. He reasoned that since he had a clear idea of a perfect being, and since he himself was imperfect, this idea must have come from a perfect source, namely God. And since God is perfect, God would not deceive him about the existence of the material world. Therefore, the physical world must exist. But Descartes' philosophy created a problem that philosophers are still wrestling with today, the mind-body problem. Descartes argued that reality consists of two completely different types of substance. The mind or soul is a thinking substance that takes up no space and cannot be divided. The body, on the other hand, is a physical substance that takes up space but cannot think. This view, known as dualism, raised a troubling question. If mind and body are completely different types of things, how can they interact? How can a non-physical mind control a physical body? Or how can physical events in the brain create mental experiences? Descartes suggested that the interaction occurred in a small gland in the brain called the pineal gland. But this explanation satisfied no one. The mind-body problem that Descartes created continues to challenge philosophers, neuroscientists and psychologists today as they try to understand the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Descartes' approach to philosophy was thoroughly mathematical. Just as geometry starts with simple, self-evident truths and builds complex proofs through logical steps, Descartes believed philosophy should proceed in the same way. He would start with his certain foundation of "I think, therefore I am," and build up all knowledge through careful logical reasoning. This mathematical approach became a defining characteristic of modern philosophy. The impact of Descartes' work was enormous. His Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, became one of the most studied philosophical works in history. In this book, Descartes takes his readers through his method of doubt day by day, showing how he arrives at certainty about his own existence, proves God's existence, and establishes the reality of the material world. The book was written as a series of meditations because Descartes wanted readers to follow his reasoning step by step, making the discoveries for themselves. The rationalist tradition. Descartes' emphasis on reason as the primary source of knowledge inspired a tradition known as rationalism. Rationalists believed that the most important truths about reality could be discovered through reason alone, without relying on sensory experience. Two of the most brilliant rationalist philosophers were Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Leibniz, both of whom built on Descartes' foundations while developing radically different conclusions. Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam to a family of Portuguese Jews who had fled the Inquisition. From an early age, Spinoza showed extraordinary intellectual gifts, mastering Hebrew, Latin, and the works of Jewish philosophers like Maimonides. But as he delved deeper into philosophy, Spinoza began developing ideas that his religious community found dangerous and heretical. Spinoza's central insight was that everything in existence is part of one single substance, which he identified with both God and nature. Unlike Descartes, who saw God as separate from the world he created, Spinoza argued that God and the world are the same thing viewed from different perspectives. This view, known as pantheism, meant that every rock, tree, animal and human being is a part of God's infinite nature. This radical idea had profound implications. If everything is part of one divine substance, then everything that happens occurs according to the eternal laws of this substance. Human beings, like everything else, are part of nature and follow natural laws. This meant that free will, as traditionally understood, is an illusion. We think we freely choose our actions. But in reality, our choices are determined by prior causes, stretching back to the beginning of time. Spinoza laid out his philosophy in a work called Ethics. But unlike other philosophers who wrote in flowing prose, Spinoza presented his ideas in the geometric method. He started with definitions and axioms, then proved propositions through formal logical steps, just like a geometry textbook. This approach reflected his belief that the universe itself follows logical mathematical principles. Spinoza's ideas about religion were particularly controversial. He argued that the Bible should be studied like any other historical document, using reason and scholarship rather than faith to understand its meaning. He claimed that miracles were impossible because they would violate the eternal laws of nature. Most shocking of all, he suggested that the popular image of God as a personal being who answers prayers and punishes sinners was based on human ignorance and wishful thinking. These ideas proved too radical for Amsterdam's Jewish community. In 1656, when Spinoza was only 24 years old, he was excommunicated from the synagogue with a curse so severe that it forbade anyone from speaking to him, reading his writings, or even coming within 4 feet of his presence. The excommunication decree called his ideas abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. Rather than recant his views, Spinoza embraced his isolation. He changed his name from the Hebrew Baruch to the Latin Benedict and made his living grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes, a skill that connected him to the new scientific discoveries of his time. Despite offers of prestigious university positions, Spinoza chose to remain independent, fearing that academic obligations might compromise his intellectual freedom. Gottfried Leibniz presented a very different vision of reality. Born in Leipzig in 1646, Leibniz was one of history's greatest polymaths, making groundbreaking contributions to mathematics, physics, logic, law, history, and philosophy. He invented calculus independently of Newton, created the binary number system that underlies modern computers, and designed calculating machines that could perform all 4 basic arithmetic operations. Leibniz disagreed fundamentally with both Descartes and Spinoza about the nature of reality. While Descartes saw reality as composed of 2 types of substance and Spinoza saw it as one substance, Leibniz argued that reality consists of an infinite number of simple substances he called monads. These monads are like spiritual atoms, each one a centre of perception and activity that reflects the entire universe from its own unique perspective. Every monad, from the simplest to the most complex, has some degree of perception and desire. Human souls are high-level monads, with clear perception and rational thought, while the monads that make up rocks and plants have only dim, confused perceptions. But here comes the strangest part of Leibniz's theory. These monads never actually interact with each other. Each monad follows its own internal program, set by God from the beginning of time, in perfect harmony with all the others. This leads to Leibniz's famous doctrine of pre-established harmony. When you decide to raise your hand, and your hand actually rises, it is not because your mind caused your body to move. Rather, God has programmed your mental monads and your bodily monads to work in perfect synchronization, like 2 clocks that always show the same time because they were wound and set together. Leibniz's solution to the mind-body problem was elegant but strange. There is no interaction between mind and body because there is no real interaction between any substances at all. Everything that appears to be interaction is actually just parallel development according to God's perfect plan. This led Leibniz to one of his most famous and controversial claims. This is the best of all possible worlds. Since God is perfect, he would necessarily choose to create the best possible world. All the evil and suffering we see around us exists because it is necessary for the overall goodness of the universe. Even the worst disasters serve some purpose in God's perfect plan. The philosophical debate between Spinoza and Leibniz over human freedom reveals the deep tensions within rationalist philosophy. Spinoza argued that since everything follows from the necessity of God's nature, human freedom is an illusion. We think we are free because we are aware of our desires, but ignorant of the causes that determine them. True freedom comes not from having uncaused choices, but from understanding our place in the natural order and accepting it with joy. Leibniz, on the other hand, tried to preserve human freedom within his deterministic system. He argued that while God knows what each person will choose, those choices are still genuinely free because they flow from the person's own nature and reasoning. A person who chooses evil does so freely, even though God knew from eternity that this choice would be made. This debate between Spinoza and Leibniz illustrates one of the central problems in philosophy: how to reconcile human freedom and moral responsibility with the apparent causal determination of all events. This problem continues to challenge philosophers today as they try to understand the implications of scientific discoveries about the brain and human behavior. The empiricist response. While the rationalists were developing their grand systematic theories based on reason, another group of philosophers was taking a completely different approach. These thinkers, known as empiricists, argued that experience, not reason, is the primary source of human knowledge. The empiricist tradition began in England with John Locke and reached its culmination in the radical skepticism of David Hume. John Locke was born in 1632, the same year as Spinoza, but his background was very different. The son of a country lawyer who fought with the parliamentary forces against King Charles I, Locke grew up in an England torn by civil war and religious conflict. He studied at Oxford University, where he became interested in experimental philosophy and medicine, eventually becoming a physician. Locke's approach to philosophy was shaped by his practical experiences in politics and medicine. Rather than trying to construct grand metaphysical systems like the rationalists, Locke wanted to understand the actual workings of the human mind. His great work, an essay concerning human understanding, published in 1690, began with a simple but revolutionary idea. The human mind at birth is like a blank piece of paper, with no innate ideas or knowledge written on it. This blank slate theory, or tabula rasa, as Locke called it, directly contradicted both the rationalists and traditional Christian doctrine. Descartes had argued that we are born with certain innate ideas, including the idea of God and basic mathematical truths. Christian theologians claimed that all humans are born with an innate knowledge of moral law. But Locke argued that all our ideas come from experience through our senses. According to Locke, we have two sources of experience: sensation and reflection. Through sensation, we receive ideas from the external world through our five senses. We see colours, hear sounds, feel textures, taste flavours and smell odours. Through reflection, we observe the operations of our own minds as we think, remember, doubt, believe and will. All our complex ideas are built up from these simple ideas of sensation and reflection through processes of combination, comparison and abstraction. This empiricist approach had profound implications for education and politics. If the mind is a blank slate shaped entirely by experience, then education becomes crucially important. We can improve society by providing better experiences for children. There are no natural aristocrats born with superior knowledge and no inherent differences between social classes that justify inequality. Locke's political philosophy, developed in his two treatises of government, applied these insights to the problem of political authority. Just as the mind starts as a blank slate, society begins in a state of nature where all people are equal and free. Government authority comes not from God or natural hierarchy, but from the consent of the governed. People agree to form governments to protect their natural rights to life, liberty and property, and governments that fail to serve this purpose can be legitimately overthrown. These ideas about government by consent and the right of revolution would later inspire the American and French revolutions. Locke's influence on the American founding fathers was enormous, with Thomas Jefferson explicitly drawing on Locke's ideas in writing the Declaration of Independence. George Berkeley, born in Ireland in 1685, pushed empiricism in an even more radical direction. Berkeley was an Anglican bishop who was deeply concerned about the growth of materialism and atheism in his time. Ironically, his solution to this problem led him to deny the existence of matter altogether. Berkeley's famous principle was esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived. According to Berkeley, physical objects exist only when they are being perceived by a mind. The tree in the forest continues to exist when no human is looking at it, only because God is always perceiving it. Berkeley argued that this view actually provided stronger proof of God's existence than traditional arguments, because it makes God's constant presence necessary for the continued existence of the world. Berkeley's idealism, as his position came to be known, seems absurd to common sense, but he defended it with ingenious arguments. He pointed out that we never actually perceive physical objects themselves, only our sensations of them. When we say we see a tree, we really mean we have certain visual sensations of green and brown shapes. When we touch it, we have tactile sensations of roughness and hardness. But the supposed material object that causes these sensations is something we never actually experience. Berkeley also argued that the very idea of matter existing independently of perception is incoherent. Matter is supposed to be something that has size, shape and motion, but no colour, taste or smell. But Berkeley pointed out that we cannot conceive of size or shape without some sensory qualities. Try to imagine a triangle that has no colour at all, not even transparent. Berkeley claimed this is impossible, showing that the idea of pure matter is meaningless. David Hume, born in Scotland in 1711, carried empiricism to its logical conclusion and arrived at a radical scepticism that shook the foundations of both philosophy and science. Hume was a brilliant and charming man who enjoyed good food, good conversation and social success, but his philosophical conclusions were deeply unsettling. Hume agreed with Locke that all our ideas come from experience, but he applied this principle more rigorously than any previous philosopher. He distinguished between two types of knowledge: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas include mathematics and logic, where we can achieve certainty because we are simply exploring the relationships between our own concepts. When we say that 2 + 2 = 4, we're not making a claim about the external world, but simply unfolding the implications of our definitions. Matters of fact, on the other hand, include all our beliefs about the world around us. Here Hume made a devastating observation. We can never be certain about matters of fact because they all depend on assumptions we cannot prove. This led him to identify several problems that continue to puzzle philosophers today. The problem of induction is perhaps Hume's most famous contribution to philosophy. We constantly make predictions about the future based on past experience. The sun has risen every morning for thousands of years, so we expect it to rise tomorrow. We have seen bread nourish people countless times, so we expect it to nourish us today. But Hume pointed out that this reasoning assumes the future will resemble the past, and we have no logical justification for this assumption. We cannot prove that the future will resemble the past by appealing to past experience, because that would be circular reasoning. We would be using the assumption that the past is a guide to the future to prove that the past is a guide to the future. Nor can we prove it by pure logic, because there is no logical contradiction in supposing that the laws of nature might change tomorrow. This problem of induction threatens to undermine all scientific knowledge. Science depends on the assumption that experiments performed in the past tell us something about what will happen in similar circumstances in the future. But if Hume is right, this assumption has no rational foundation. Hume also identified what later philosophers called the is-ought problem. We often try to derive conclusions about what we should do from premises about what is the case. For example, we might argue that because humans are naturally social creatures, we ought to live in communities. But Hume pointed out that statements about what ought to be the case cannot be logically derived from statements about what is the case. There is a logical gap between descriptive and normative claims that cannot be bridged by reason alone. This creates a problem for moral philosophy. If moral conclusions cannot be derived from factual premises, then moral reasoning seems to lack the objective foundation that philosophers have traditionally sought. Hume's own solution was to ground morality in human sentiments and emotions rather than in reason, but this made moral judgments seem subjective and relative. Hume's most systematic presentation of these skeptical arguments appeared in his Treatise of Human Nature, published when he was only 28 years old. The book famously fell dead-born from the press, as Hume later complained, receiving little attention from the intellectual community. But Hume's ideas would eventually revolutionize philosophy, influencing thinkers from Immanuel Kant to contemporary philosophers of science. Perhaps Hume's most influential contribution was what later came to be known as Hume's fork. Hume argued that all meaningful statements fall into one of two categories. They are either relations of ideas that can be known with certainty but tell us nothing about the world, or they are matters of fact that tell us about the world but cannot be known with certainty. Any statement that falls into neither category is meaningless. This distinction would later influence the logical positivists of the 20th century, who used a version of Hume's fork to argue that metaphysical and theological statements are literally meaningless because they can neither be proven by logic nor verified by experience. The century from 1600 to 1700 thus saw the birth of distinctly modern approaches to philosophy. The rationalists tried to rebuild human knowledge on the foundation of reason, developing grand systematic theories about the nature of reality. The empiricists insisted that experience is the source of all knowledge, leading ultimately to skeptical conclusions about the limits of human reason. The debates between these traditions established many of the central problems that philosophers continue to grapple with today. The relationship between mind and body, the nature of human freedom, the foundations of knowledge, and the basis of moral judgment. These 17th century philosophers transformed philosophy from a primarily theological discipline into an autonomous field of inquiry. They established the methods and problems that would define philosophy for centuries to come, creating a legacy that continues to shape how we think about knowledge, reality, and human nature. Their work reminds us that the most fundamental questions about existence and knowledge are not easily answered, and that the search for certainty and truth requires both intellectual courage and philosophical humility. Chapter 8. Enlightenment and Revolution, 1700 to 1800. As the 18th century dawned, the philosophical foundations laid by Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley and Hume began to bear fruit in ways their creators could never have imagined. The rational methods and skeptical questioning that had emerged from the previous century's intellectual battles were about to transform not just philosophy, but the very structure of European society itself. This was the age that would come to be known as the Enlightenment, a period when human reason was celebrated as the key to understanding nature, reforming society, and achieving human happiness. The transformation was most visible in France, where a new generation of thinkers called philosophes began applying philosophical principles to practical problems of government, religion, and social organization. These were not abstract theorists working in isolation, but public intellectuals who wrote for educated audiences and sought to influence political and social reform. They inherited Locke's faith in human reason and his belief that knowledge comes from experience, but they used these ideas to challenge the traditional authorities of church and monarchy in ways that would ultimately lead to revolution. The Age of Reason. François-Marie Arouet, who took the pen name Voltaire, embodied the spirit of this new age more than anyone else. Born in 1694 to a middle-class Parisian family, Voltaire showed early signs of the wit and irreverence that would make him the most famous writer in Europe. His father wanted him to become a lawyer, but young François-Marie was more interested in writing satirical poems about the French court than studying legal texts. This preference for clever criticism over respectable conformity would shape his entire career. Voltaire's education came not just from books, but from bitter personal experience with the injustices of the old regime. In 1717 he was imprisoned in the Bastille for 11 months after writing verses that supposedly insulted the regent of France. Later, in 1726, he was beaten by the servants of a nobleman who felt insulted by Voltaire's sharp tongue. When Voltaire challenged the nobleman to a duel, he found himself imprisoned again and then exiled to England for 3 years. This exile proved to be the making of Voltaire as a philosopher. In England, he discovered a society that seemed to embody many of the principles that French philosophers could only dream about. Religious tolerance was greater, political freedom more extensive, and intellectual life more vibrant than anything he had known in France. He met leading English thinkers, studied Newton's physics, and absorbed Locke's political philosophy. Most importantly, he saw how these ideas could work in practice. When Voltaire returned to France, he brought with him a vision of what an enlightened society might look like. His letters on the English became a devastating critique of French society by contrast. Where France had religious persecution, England had tolerance. Where France had arbitrary royal power, England had constitutional government. Where France had rigid social hierarchy, England allowed greater social mobility. Voltaire's method was subtle but effective. Rather than directly attacking French institutions, he praised English ones and let readers draw their own conclusions. Religious tolerance became Voltaire's greatest passion. He had witnessed the brutal persecution of French Protestants and was horrified by the fanaticism it revealed. His famous battle cry became "Écrasez l'infâme," or "crush the infamous thing," by which he meant religious superstition and persecution. Voltaire was not an atheist, but rather a deist who believed in God as the creator of natural laws while rejecting organized religion's claims to supernatural revelation. Voltaire's approach to religious criticism was typically clever and indirect. Instead of attacking Christianity head-on, he wrote works like Candide that satirized philosophical optimism while implicitly questioning divine providence. In this masterpiece, the naive young Candide travels the world with his tutor, Dr. Pangloss, who insists that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, even as they encounter an endless series of wars, natural disasters, and human cruelties. Voltaire was directly targeting Leibniz's claim that this is the best of all possible worlds, but his real target was any system of thought that justified human suffering by appealing to abstract principles. The spread of Enlightenment ideas was greatly aided by new forms of intellectual sociability that emerged in 18th century Europe. The most famous of these were the Parisian salons, informal gatherings hosted by intelligent and well-educated women who brought together writers, philosophers, scientists, and political figures for conversation and debate. These salons created a new kind of public sphere where ideas could be discussed freely, away from the formal constraints of universities and churches. Madame Geoffrin's salon became the most influential of these gathering places, attracting visitors from across Europe who came to participate in the intellectual ferment of Paris. Here, ideas that might seem abstract and academic when confined to scholarly treatises became topics of lively social conversation. Philosophical principles were tested against practical experience, and theoretical debates were shaped by their potential consequences for real-world politics and social relations. This salon culture helps explain why Enlightenment philosophy had such practical impact. Ideas were not just developed by isolated thinkers, but were constantly discussed, refined, and applied by communities of intellectuals who understood their social and political implications. The transition from philosophical theory to political action was made easier by the existence of these informal networks that connected abstract thinkers with practical reformers. The greatest monument to Enlightenment ambition was the Encyclopedia project led by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. This massive undertaking, which eventually filled 28 volumes, aimed to collect and organize all human knowledge according to rational principles. The project reflected the Enlightenment's faith that human reason could understand and improve every aspect of life, from agriculture and manufacturing to government and religion. Diderot, the son of a cutler from a small French town, had originally studied for the priesthood before discovering his passion for literature and philosophy. His path to enlightenment was intellectual rather than social, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how things work and a deep skepticism about traditional authorities. D'Alembert, by contrast, was a brilliant mathematician who had been abandoned as a baby on the steps of a Paris church and raised by a poor glazier's wife, though he was later discovered to be the illegitimate son of a prominent salon hostess. The encyclopedia was far more than a reference work. It was a weapon in the battle against ignorance, superstition, and oppression. Articles on religion subtly undermined orthodox beliefs by treating them as historical phenomena rather than eternal truths. Articles on government implicitly criticized absolute monarchy by describing alternative forms of political organization. Articles on science and technology celebrated human reason's power to understand and control nature. The project faced constant harassment from government censors and religious authorities who recognized its subversive potential. Volumes were banned, contributors were threatened with imprisonment, and Diderot himself spent several months in jail. but the work continued, supported by subscribers across Europe who saw it as a symbol of intellectual freedom and human progress. The encyclopedia's impact extended far beyond its immediate readership. It helped create a new vision of knowledge as something that should be publicly accessible rather than confined to privileged elites. It demonstrated the practical value of scientific understanding by showing how theoretical knowledge could be applied to improve agriculture, manufacturing, and other aspects of daily life. Most importantly, it embodied the Enlightenment's faith that human reason could solve human problems if given freedom to operate. Social contract theorists. While the philosophes were spreading Enlightenment ideas throughout European society, political philosophers were developing new theories about the foundations of government that would have revolutionary implications. These thinkers shared a common approach. They imagined what human life would be like in a state of nature before government existed, then asked what kind of government rational people would choose to create. This method allowed them to argue that political authority comes from human agreement rather than divine command or natural hierarchy. Thomas Hobbes had begun this tradition in the previous century, but his conclusions were so disturbing that later thinkers felt compelled to develop alternative theories. Writing during the English Civil War, Hobbes had argued that life in the state of nature would be a war of all against all, making existence solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this condition, rational people would agree to surrender all their rights to an absolute sovereign who could maintain peace and order. Hobbes's political philosophy emerged from his materialist understanding of human nature. He believed that humans are essentially sophisticated machines driven by appetite and aversion, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. In the state of nature, these competing desires would inevitably lead to conflict as people fought over scarce resources. The only solution was to create an artificial person, the state, with enough power to overawe all potential troublemakers. This Hobbesian vision horrified later Enlightenment thinkers because it seemed to justify absolute monarchy and eliminate individual freedom. If Hobbes was right, then the price of escaping chaos was surrendering liberty. But what if Hobbes was wrong about human nature? What if people in the state of nature were not inevitably hostile to each other? This question led to very different conclusions about the proper form of government. John Locke, whose empiricist philosophy we encountered in the previous chapter, developed a much more optimistic view of both human nature and political possibility. Writing after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had established constitutional monarchy in England, Locke argued that people in the state of nature would generally be peaceful and cooperative, guided by natural law that teaches that all humans are equal and have natural rights to life, liberty and property. Locke's state of nature was not Hobbes's war of all against all, but rather a generally peaceful condition marred by occasional disputes and inconveniences. People would sometimes disagree about their rights, and there would be no impartial judge to settle conflicts. Some individuals might try to violate others' rights, and there would be no reliable way to punish them. To solve these problems, rational people would agree to create government, but only a limited government that protects their natural rights rather than destroying them. This theory had radical implications for political practice. If government exists only to protect natural rights, then governments that violate those rights lose their legitimacy and can be rightfully overthrown. Locke argued that people retain the right to revolution when government becomes tyrannical, a doctrine that would later inspire both the American and French revolutions. Locke's emphasis on property rights reflected his understanding of how commercial society was transforming traditional social relations. In agricultural societies, wealth comes primarily from land ownership, creating relatively fixed hierarchies between landowners and peasants. But commercial societies create new forms of wealth through trade and manufacturing, allowing individuals to improve their circumstances through industry and innovation. Locke's political philosophy was designed for this new kind of society, where economic opportunity and social mobility required protection of individual rights rather than maintenance of traditional privileges. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in Geneva in 1712, developed the most radical and influential version of social contract theory. Rousseau's personal background was very different from the comfortable circumstances of most Enlightenment thinkers. His mother died shortly after his birth, his father abandoned him when he was 10, and he spent much of his early life wandering across Europe, working as a servant, secretary, and music teacher. This experience of social marginality gave Rousseau a perspective on inequality and injustice that more privileged philosophers often lacked. Rousseau's great insight was that human nature is fundamentally good, but civilization corrupts it. In his discourse on inequality, he argued that humans in the state of nature were essentially noble savages, living simple lives free from the artificial desires and social conflicts that plague civilized society. The invention of private property created inequality, as some people accumulated wealth while others remained poor. Government was created not to protect everyone's rights equally, as Locke claimed, but to protect the property of the rich against the resentment of the poor. This analysis led Rousseau to his famous declaration that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. The chains are not just political, but social and psychological. Civilized society creates artificial needs and desires that make people dependent on others' opinions and approval. We become slaves to fashion, status, and reputation, losing touch with our natural goodness and authentic selves. But Rousseau did not advocate returning to the state of nature, which he recognized was impossible. Instead, he argued for creating a new kind of society based on a genuinely legitimate social contract. In the social contract, he described a form of government where people surrender their individual wills to the general will of the community, creating a society where everyone is both ruler and ruled. Rousseau's general will was not simply majority rule, but rather the common good that emerges when citizens think about what is best for the community as a whole rather than pursuing their narrow self-interest. This requires a special kind of civic education that teaches people to identify with the common good and subordinate their private desires to public needs. These social contract theories had profound influence on the political revolutions that swept the Atlantic world in the late 18th century. American revolutionaries drew heavily on Locke's ideas about natural rights and the right of revolution to justify their break with Britain. The Declaration of Independence echoes Locke's language almost word for word when it declares that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed and that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that fail to protect their rights. The French Revolution showed the influence of all three social contract theorists in different phases. Early moderate revolutionaries like Lafayette drew on Locke's ideas about constitutional government and individual rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that the source of all sovereignty lies essentially in the nation. But as the revolution became more radical, Rousseau's ideas about the general will and popular sovereignty became more influential. Robespierre and other Jacobin leaders justified the terror by claiming to represent the general will against the enemies of the people. Immanuel Kant, The Critical Revolution. While the Enlightenment was transforming European society through its practical applications, the most profound philosophical revolution of the 18th century was taking place in the mind of a quiet professor in the remote Prussian city of Königsberg. Immanuel Kant, born in 1724 to a family of modest means, lived one of the most uneventful external lives in the history of philosophy. He never travelled more than a few miles from his birthplace, never married, and followed such a regular daily routine that neighbours could set their clocks by his afternoon walks. But this outwardly conventional life concealed one of the most revolutionary minds in human history. Kant single-handedly transformed virtually every area of philosophy and created a new way of thinking about knowledge, morality, and human nature that continues to influence thinkers today. His critical philosophy represents both the culmination of Enlightenment rationalism and a fundamental challenge to its basic assumptions. Kant's philosophical awakening came from reading David Hume's skeptical arguments about causation and induction. As Kant later wrote, Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumber by showing that our most basic beliefs about the world cannot be justified by either reason or experience alone. If Hume was right, then both the rationalist and empiricist traditions had reached dead ends. Rationalists like Leibniz claimed too much for human reason, while empiricists like Hume left too little room for genuine knowledge. Kant spent more than a decade developing a response to Hume that would preserve the possibility of genuine knowledge while acknowledging the limits that Hume had identified. His solution was revolutionary. Instead of asking how the mind conforms to reality, Kant asked how reality conforms to the mind. Perhaps the reason we can have reliable knowledge about certain aspects of experience is that the mind actively structures experience according to its own inherent principles. This Copernican revolution in philosophy was Kant's greatest insight. Just as Copernicus had solved astronomical problems by suggesting that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than vice versa, Kant solved epistemological problems by suggesting that objects conform to knowledge rather than knowledge conforming to objects. We can know certain things about experience with certainty because the mind necessarily structures all experience according to certain fundamental categories and principles. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781 after years of intensive work, laid out this new theory of knowledge in systematic detail. Kant argued that the mind contributes certain forms and categories to all experience. Space and time are not features of things in themselves, but rather forms of human intuition that we necessarily impose on whatever we experience. Causation is not a relationship we discover in the world, but rather a category that the mind uses to organize experience. This theory allowed Kant to answer Hume's skeptical challenges while preserving the possibility of genuine knowledge. We can be certain that every event has a cause, not because we have experienced constant conjunction in the past, but because causation is a necessary condition for the possibility of experience itself. We can know that mathematical truths apply to the physical world, not because we have verified them through observation, but because space and time are forms that the mind necessarily imposes on all possible experiences. Kant distinguished between three types of judgments: analytic a priori, synthetic a posteriori, and synthetic a priori. Analytic a priori judgments, like all bachelors are unmarried, are true by definition and tell us nothing about the world. Synthetic a posteriori judgments, like "this rose is red," tell us about the world but can only be known through experience. The crucial category is synthetic a priori judgments, which tell us something meaningful about the world but can be known independently of particular experiences. Mathematical judgments like 7 plus 5 equals 12 are synthetic a priori because they tell us something about quantity relationships that applies to all possible experiences, yet we can know them without conducting empirical surveys. Scientific principles like "every event has a cause" are synthetic a priori because they tell us something about the structure of natural phenomena that must hold for all possible experiences. But Kant's critical philosophy came with a heavy price. If the mind structures experience according to its own principles, then we can never know things as they are in themselves, independent of our mental contribution. Kant distinguished between phenomena, things as they appear to us through the structures of human cognition, and noumena, things as they are in themselves. We can have genuine knowledge of phenomena, but noumena remains forever beyond human understanding. This limitation had profound implications for traditional metaphysical questions about God, freedom, and immortality. Kant argued that theoretical reason cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, the reality of human freedom, or the immortality of the soul, because these involve claims about things in themselves rather than phenomena. The traditional arguments of natural theology fail because they try to extend human knowledge beyond its proper limits. But Kant did not abandon these ideas entirely. In his critique of practical reason, he argued that moral experience gives us practical reasons to believe in God, freedom, and immortality, even though theoretical reason cannot establish them. Morality requires that we act as if we are free, that virtue and happiness can ultimately be harmonized, and that there is a God who can guarantee this harmony. These ideas function as postulates of practical reason, necessary assumptions for moral life, even though they cannot be theoretically demonstrated. Kant's moral philosophy centered on the concept of duty and the categorical imperative. Unlike hypothetical imperatives that tell us what to do if we want to achieve certain goals, the categorical imperative commands unconditionally. Kant formulated this principle in several ways, the most famous being, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." This formula requires us to test our proposed actions by asking whether we could rationally will everyone to act in the same way. Lying fails this test, because universal lying would destroy the institution of truth-telling that makes lying possible in the first place. Promise-breaking fails because universal promise-breaking would destroy the institution of promising. The categorical imperative thus provides a rational foundation for moral duties that does not depend on particular desires, cultural conventions, or religious commands. Kant also formulated the categorical imperative as requiring us to treat humanity, whether in ourselves or others, always as an end and never merely as a means. This principle rules out treating people as mere tools for our purposes, while allowing us to pursue cooperative relationships where people serve each other's purposes voluntarily. This moral philosophy reflected Kant's deep commitment to human dignity and autonomy. Unlike animals, which act from instinct, or things which are determined by natural laws, rational beings can choose to act from duty rather than inclination. This capacity for moral choice is what makes humans worthy of respect and gives them rights that must not be violated. Kant's political philosophy followed from his moral theory. In Toward Perpetual Peace, he argued that reason demands the establishment of republican governments, international law, and eventually a world federation that could eliminate war. Just as individuals must escape the state of nature by creating civil society, nations must escape international anarchy by creating legal institutions that can resolve conflicts peacefully. The influence of Kant's critical philosophy was immediate and enormous. His work forced every subsequent philosopher to grapple with his insights about the active role of mind in constituting experience and the limits of human knowledge. Even philosophers who rejected Kant's specific conclusions had to develop their theories in response to the problems he had identified. Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, captured the spirit of his age in the motto Sapere aude, or Dare to Know. Enlightenment for Kant meant having the courage to use your own understanding rather than relying on the guidance of others. But Kant's critical philosophy also showed that this daring to know must be tempered by humility about the limits of human reason. We can achieve genuine knowledge within the bounds of possible experience, but we must resist the temptation to extend our claims beyond these bounds. German idealism begins. Kant's critical philosophy created as many problems as it solved, and the generation of German philosophers who followed him struggled to overcome what they saw as unacceptable limitations in his system. The most troubling aspect of Kant's philosophy was his claim that we can never know things in themselves, only things as they appear through the forms and categories of human cognition. This seemed to leave a mysterious realm of noumena forever beyond human understanding and to make the relationship between appearance and reality fundamentally problematic. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, born in 1762 to a poor family in rural Saxony, became the first major philosopher to attempt a systematic revision of Kant's critical philosophy. Fichte's background was very different from Kant's middle-class respectability. His intelligence was discovered by accident when a local nobleman heard the young peasant boy perfectly recite a sermon he had heard only once. The nobleman sponsored Fichte's education, but poverty and social marginality marked his character throughout his life. Fichte argued that Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena was incoherent and unnecessary. If we can never know anything about things in themselves, why should we believe they exist at all? Fichte proposed eliminating noumena entirely and grounding all reality in the activity of the self or ego. The fundamental principle of philosophy, according to Fichte, is that the self posits itself. All reality, including the apparent external world, emerges from the self's activity of self-positing. This may sound like subjective idealism, similar to Berkeley's position, but Fichte insisted that his absolute idealism was different. The self that posits all reality is not the individual empirical ego, but rather an absolute ego that underlies and makes possible all particular selves. Individual consciousness emerges through a complex dialectical process in which the absolute ego posits itself, then posits a not-self in opposition to itself, and finally posits limited selves that stand in relation to objects. Fichte's system was extraordinarily abstract and difficult to understand, but it had the advantage of overcoming Kant's dualism between appearance and reality. If everything is grounded in the activity of the absolute ego, then there is no mysterious realm beyond human understanding. Knowledge becomes a form of self-knowledge, and the apparent external world becomes an expression of rational activity rather than something foreign to reason. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, born in 1775, began as a follower of Fichte but developed an even more ambitious system of absolute idealism. Schelling was a genuine prodigy who mastered ancient languages as a child and was writing sophisticated philosophical works while still a teenager. His early brilliance brought him to the attention of major philosophers and secured him university positions at an unusually young age. Schelling agreed with Fichte that Kant's thing in itself had to be eliminated, but he argued that Fichte's absolute ego was too one-sided. Why should the mind be more fundamental than nature? Schelling proposed instead that mind and nature are two sides of a single absolute reality that he called the absolute identity of subjective and objective, ideal and real. Nature, according to Schelling, is the unconscious mind, while the mind is conscious of nature. The same fundamental principles that govern mental activity also govern natural processes, which is why human reason can understand natural laws. Art plays a special role in Schelling's system because it reveals the identity of conscious and unconscious activity, showing how natural beauty and human creativity emerge from the same absolute source. Schelling's philosophy of nature was particularly influential among the Romantic poets and artists who were rebelling against the mechanical worldview of Enlightenment science, where Newtonian physics had portrayed nature as a machine governed by mathematical laws. Schelling presented nature as a living organism expressing the same rational principles that appear in human consciousness. This vision appealed to thinkers who wanted to maintain scientific rationality while preserving a sense of nature's beauty and meaning. Both Fichte and Schelling were preparing the ground for an even more systematic and comprehensive philosophy that would attempt to overcome all the dualisms and limitations of previous thought. Their work pointed toward the possibility of an absolute idealism that could explain the development of reality, consciousness and history according to rational principles, while preserving human freedom and moral responsibility. The stage was being set for Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who would create the most ambitious philosophical system in Western history and bring German idealism to its culmination. But that story belongs to the next chapter of philosophy's ongoing development. The 18th century thus witnessed both the practical triumph of Enlightenment ideals in political revolution and social reform, and their theoretical transformation through Kant's critical philosophy and the emergence of German idealism. The philosophes had shown how rational criticism could challenge traditional authorities and improve human conditions. The social contract theorists had provided new foundations for legitimate government based on human consent rather than divine command. Kant had revolutionized our understanding of knowledge and morality while preserving human dignity and freedom. And the early German idealists had begun the ambitious project of creating a completely rational account of reality that would overcome all the dualisms and limitations of previous philosophy. This remarkable century demonstrated both the power and the limits of human reason. The Enlightenment's faith in reason had helped create more just and free societies, but the critical examination of reason's foundations had revealed unexpected complexities and limitations. The tension between reason's practical success and its theoretical problems would continue to challenge philosophers as they entered the 19th century with its new problems of industrialization, nationalism and social change.